I love the way Mark makes the UCLA School of Arts and Architecture sound fantastic. Thank you. If you're just joining us, welcome to week 8 of our quarter, and it's so nice to see so many familiar faces. The question tonight, of course, is what is citizenship? And it's also Thanksgiving week, so I'm also very glad that students, you haven't gone home yet. And in the spirit of giving thanks, I want to acknowledge the UCLA people whose work has continued to contribute to 10 questions. So I'm just going to say some names. Most of you have already heard them, but it's worth saying again. Andres Cuervo and the Centennial Committee, Brett Steele, who is the Dean. Thank you. Arsenio, Mark, Ginger, Erica, and Marcia from the Department of World Arts and Cultures, Anne-Marie Burke, Louise Kale, and Kylie Kerrigan, who are my partners in putting this presentation together. And a big shout out tonight to our 4 amazing teaching assistants, grad students who are getting their degrees in the School of the Arts and Architecture, Erin Cooney, Kate Taylor Hasty, Jackie Davis up there, and Brisa Smith-Flores. Thank you all. Whoa, y'all. Also, the dedicated camera crew, my mother, okay. As a land-grant institution, we recognize the Gabrielino Tongva people as the original caretakers of this land, and we are grateful to be visitors in this place. This evening, I'm going to let the experts joining us on stage frame the discussion of citizenship in their own particular ways. However, I do want to share a few things that I found meaningful as I was considering this question. First, I want to share a short excerpt from a lecture given by Toni Morrison in 2002. In this piece, she spoke of the tremendous mass movements of people over the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, a movement of workers, intellectuals, refugees, of armies crossing oceans and continents, of immigrants through custom offices and hidden routes, seeking, among other things, sanctuary from persecution, exile, violence, and poverty. And Toni Morrison said, "The spectacle of mass movement draws attention inevitably to the borders, the poorest places, the vulnerable points where one's concept of home is seen as being menaced by foreigners. Much of the alarm hovering at the borders, the gates, is stoked, it seems to me, by, first, both the threat and promise of globalism, and second, an uneasy relationship with our own foreignness, our own rapidly disintegrating sense of belonging. The threat and promise of globalism and an uneasy relationship with our own foreignness, our own rapidly disintegrating sense of belonging." People come to a place seeking belonging for all kinds of reasons, but today, particularly in the midst of a humanitarian crisis on our southern border, and indeed all over the world, I'd like to share an excerpt from the poem Home by Warsan Shira, a British poet of Somali origin. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well, your neighbors running faster than you, breath bloody in their throats, the boy you went to school with who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factory is holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. No one leaves home unless home chases you, fire under feet, hot blood in your belly. It's not something you ever thought of doing until the blade burnt threats into your neck. And even then you carried the anthem under your breath, only tearing up your passport in airport toilets sobbing as each mouthful of paper made it clear you wouldn't be going back. You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one burns their palms under trains, beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled means something more than journey. No one crawls under fences. No one wants to be beaten, pitied. I want to go home, but home is the mouth of a shark. Home is the barrel of the gun, and no one would leave home unless home chased you to the shore, unless home told you to quicken your legs, leave your clothes behind, crawl through the desert, wade through the oceans. Drown, save, be hunger, beg, forget pride. Your survival is most important. No one leaves home until home is a sweaty voice in your ear saying, leave, run away from me now. I don't know what I've become, but I know that anywhere is safer than here. Please join me in welcoming our guests this evening. I'd like to ask you all to come on out, and I will introduce you. Let's put our hands together for Leisy Abrego, Hiroshi Motomura, and Marike Splint. Hiroshi Motomura is the Susan Westerberg Prager Distinguished Professor of Law at UCLA. He is a teacher and scholar of immigration and citizenship with influence across a range of academic disciplines and as well as in federal, state, and local policymaking. Professor Motomura has testified in the US Congress, has served as co-counsel or a volunteer consultant in many litigated cases and policy matters, and has been a member of the American Bar Association's Commission on Immigration. In the fall of 2008, he was an outside advisor to the Obama-Biden Transition Team's Working Group on Immigration Policy, and he claims to this day that his most important public moment was on tryguys.com. So check it out. Leisy Abrego is a professor in the newly renamed Department of Chicano, and Central American Studies at UCLA. Her research and teaching interests are in Central American migration, Latino families, inequalities created by gender, and the production of illegality through US immigration laws. Through her scholarship analyzing legal consciousness, illegality, and legal violence, Abrego explores how different subsectors of Latina, Latino, Latinx immigrants, including undocumented students, internalize and react to immigration policies in search of justice in the United States. She also dedicates much of her time to supporting and advocating for refugees and immigrants by writing editorials and pro bono expert declarations in asylum cases. Welcome, Leisy. And Marike Splint is a theater maker from the Netherlands based in Los Angeles, whose work has been presented by festivals and theaters all around the world. She specializes in creating work in public space that explores the relationship between people, places, and identity. She has created shows in sites ranging from transitional neighborhoods to wide open meadows, to taxi cabs, train stations, and hotel rooms. She serves as an assistant professor in our Department of Theater at UCLA. Welcome, Marike. So, with all of that formality aside, we're going to take our seats, and by prior arrangement, Leisy going to lead us into the very first talk. Thank you, Leisy.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank Vic for inviting me to participate and Anne-Marie for helping with all of the details. I want to say that this question about what is citizenship is a broad one. If you look in sociology and political science and philosophy and ethnic studies, there is a lot written about this. And so I'm going to try to just very briefly share a little bit about those. There are threads in this vast area of scholarship that focus on the legal foundation of what is citizenship, that determines the rights and responsibilities that a nation state presumably bestows upon the people who are born there or who reside there. And this approach tries to capture how nation states determine who legitimately belongs within borders. It tries to claim that it provides equal rights to all citizens and establishes a kind of formal nationality that a lot of us then presume is followed by a sense of belonging. In other threads, scholars discuss the ways that we experience citizenship. And in this line of thinking, we look a lot at many people who are marginalized based on gender, race, class, sexuality, disabilities, religion. And that shouldn't be surprising to us, given that we are in a country that was founded upon the idea that citizenship should only be for white males who own property. Things have changed, but we continue to see inequalities across how we experience citizenship. So again, we can think of it as this formal nationality, and we can think of it as being about bestowing rights. We can also think about citizenship as a lived experience, and it is through that that we see more of the contested terrain and the inequalities. And so if we focus on that aspect, we might think about different kinds of questions to ask, like who belongs in our society, who participates in our society, who has a voice, and who has full rights. I won't be able to cover all of that. I won't have answers for you, but I do want to draw on my research and give you 3 examples of the ways that citizenship plays out in different migrants and their families' lives. So I'll begin with US citizens and mixed status families. We know that there are over 4 million children under the age of 18 who are US citizens who live in what we call mixed status families that include at least one parent who is undocumented. The 14th Amendment grants citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, regardless of where their parents were born and regardless of their parents' legal status. So we have lots of these cases, US citizens in mixed status families then have to navigate what it means to be a US citizen in the space of being surrounded by loved ones who tense up around police officers, who tense up around immigration checkpoints, right? They have to grow up thinking about what it means that they have access to rights and resources that the people who care for them don't access. And that makes it a very complicated situation. In my research, I've interviewed people who, after having been admitted to college, decide that they will not go because they feel so guilty that they can access financial aid, but their older siblings can't. They decide instead to work in the service industry and do other things because to them it feels so unfair that they can do things that their siblings can't. I've also seen people starting to drive at the age of 13 because they know that if the police stops one of their parents while driving, that parent might be detained and deported, but they figure that even if you're 13, you'll get a ticket and then not have anyone have to separate from the family. So these kinds of experiences mean that you grow up thinking about what it means that a nation claims you and provides your nationality, but refuses to do the same for the people that you love the most. And in that way, you can imagine the guilt, the responsibility, the challenges of feeling that you can fully participate in such a society. My next example is from transnational families, families in which 2 or more core members live across borders. And in this case, I'm going to draw on a personal example. My family has a history of having been a transnational family. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, had to leave El Salvador after years of trying to provide for her kids and not being able to do so. And she came to the United States in the 1960s by herself, leaving behind 4 children with her mother, my great-grandmother. After getting here, she worked in mostly as a housekeeper in a hotel, and it took her several years to find any kind of pathway to citizenship. And it was only at that point that she could apply for her children to join her here. So between the moment she left and the time that her kids could come, 14 years passed by. 4 decades later, my mother, who very recently turned 60, still can't talk about her childhood without crying. She remembers how much she longed to be with her mother all of those years, and even though she's near her now and sees her often, it never is something that she can recover from. So I wrote a book about these experiences. I interviewed dozens of Salvadoran families who live in similar conditions, and I asked my mother, who taught herself how to paint about 15 years ago, if she could reflect on her experience as a child in a transnational family, and this is what she painted. The painting reveals her childhood and the way that she imagined her mother as a larger-than-life, distant but ever-present figure overseeing the small town and the small life that she had in San Martin. The painful separation is evident in the tears of all of the people in the painting as they fall into Lago Ilopango, the lake that was near where she grew up. Her mother, meanwhile, in the painting is the largest tree of the plaza. She's rooted in the town even though she's physically absent. And my mom hoped that she and her siblings, my aunts, and their daily lives always occupied her mother's mind. The cross that you see at the front of the forehead represents the tragic death of my uncle, who drowned just months before they received the immigrant visa to be reunited with their mother. So I mentioned this because citizenship here plays a central role in why they had to be apart for so many years. It took a very long, expensive, and bureaucratic process for this family to be reunited again. And in the meantime, as a working class migrant, my grandmother did not participate in the promises of citizenship. She was busy working, and all that citizenship meant for her was the chance to be able to reunite with her children. Meanwhile, my mom and my aunt, who were legal citizens of El Salvador, they had access to limited schooling and all of the limited rights that are guaranteed by a rather politically unstable nation state. But they were constantly missing their mother and only thinking about a future in which they could be together, which prevented them from participating in the society that they lived in. They were not civically engaged. They were not politically informed. They were only thinking about a time when they could have citizenship elsewhere. When you grow up in that way, you don't fully have a voice and you don't fully have participation in either society. And so we think of citizenship as being determined by what happens within nation states, but these things cross borders and deeply impact people's lives. I also want to talk about another form that citizenship can take even when you have people who reside without legal authorization in the country, right? So There are ways that undocumented migrants in the US enact citizenship in different moments, right? So political activism and civic engagement give people voice even when legally they are not allowed to participate in the promises of citizenship. There are different groups who have done this. Undocumented Central American migrants, for example, as soon as they arrived in the 1980s, started to organize to demand that the US stop intervening militarily in their home countries. There are people from that same generation who also organized in labor unions to demand better working conditions and fair wages, notably in various industries, but also in particular in the very successful Justice for Janitors campaign of the 1990s. They organized to demand the possibility of stable legal statuses. Even though many still don't have citizenship, they were able to procure temporary protected status, or TPS, which then went on to serve as a foundation for what we now know as the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, DACA. Undocumented youth have also been immigrants who, without citizenship status or rights, have frequently over the last decade raised their voices and exerted political agency to change the direction of public policy and to demand human rights. So in this way, their actions and the way that they practice citizenship teaches us lessons about what it means beyond just a legal status. I want to end my portion of this talk by kind of putting out other questions about citizenship, mainly by bringing in the concept of settler colonialism. I know that many of us, most of us probably have been taught that colonization happened, that in the Americas we had colonies that were set up by Portugal, by Spain, by Britain, and that after some time the populations here were able to organize and fight and become independent from those colonizers. But Native American scholars have been teaching us now for some time that we need to rethink that we need to understand that the colonizers didn't actually leave, that they came and they set up laws and they changed our relationship to the land, to think about land and space and natural resources as things that we can own rather than as co-inhabitants of this earth, right? And so if we take that into consideration and understand that settler colonialism has set up a system of laws that then determine citizenship and determine unequal rights for people, how do we then rethink what citizenship is and who should have rights and to what spaces and how and why? So I leave you with that, and I hope that we can continue that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Leisy, and thank you, Vic, and everyone who helped organize this tonight to foster an interdisciplinary dialogue that is really important. So my name is Marike Splint. I am a citizen of the Netherlands and a resident in the US. What is citizenship? So my short answer to that question is, I'm not sure. And my long answer to that question is, I'm not sure, and I'm gonna tell you why. So when Vic asked me to join this panel, it was because of the work that I do as a theater artist and the themes that I tend to focus on with my work, the relationship between people, place, and identity, and notions of belonging. So initially I thought I was gonna come here today and talk about my work. But as we got closer to this date, the question that kept coming up is, why am I interested in these questions, and how has my family's complex relationship to the notion of citizenship informed my creative practice as an artist? So the story of my family is one that I never really tell in public. Sometimes I will refer to it in an artist statement, But since it doesn't easily fall into prevalent narratives, I tend to uncomplicate it when I talk about it. And so today I'm gonna complicate it. We're going to jump between countries and centuries, so bear with me. We are starting in Souk El Khamis, a small village in Tunisia. This is the village where my mother is born in 1950, a moment where Tunisia is a French protectorate, which is similar to being a colony, just slightly less bad. Souk El Khamis means market on Thursday, and the next village is called Market on Wednesday, which is basically the only distinguishing character of the village. So this is what my mother paints when she talks about that village. She describes it as an idyllic place surrounded by green hills filled with poppies, and maybe once a day a train will stop. So my mother is born as the 8th of 9 children in a Jewish family with Tunisian citizenship. The language spoken at home is mostly Arabic, the music is Arabic, and the food of Shabbat is couscous. So let's briefly zoom out here. How come there is Jewish presence in North Africa? So this also dates back to 1492, the year Columbus set sail. At that time, there's a very large Jewish population in what is now contemporary Spain that has been living there for about 1,700 years. But it is the era of the Inquisition, so in 1492, the Spanish edicts ordered their Jewish residents to choose one of 3 options. The first one, convert to Catholicism. The second one, remain Jewish but leave the kingdom by a certain deadline. And the third one was to be executed. Needless to say, many Jews left, and my family ended up in North Africa. So at the time that my mother is born, her family has been in what is now Tunisia for half a millennium. And this is a picture of my 2 great-grandfathers around 1900, and the moustache game is on point. To close off this sort of Spanish sidestep that I made, in 2015, Spain passed a law to grant Spanish citizenship to the descendants of Jewish families who had fled Spain in the late 15th century. So let's go back to Tunisia in the 50s. This is my mother's birth certificate. Because it was a French protectorate, of course, the administrative paperwork is in French. On the bottom left, you can see her name, Lucienne Rebha Mimouni. It's a strategic name chosen by my grandparents. Lucienne is a French name. It honors the French rulers. Rebha is an Arab middle name because they were living in an Arab country. Mimouni is a Jewish last name, the name that contains the spiritual heritage. All the 9 siblings of my mother have the exact same construction of their name. In 1956, Tunisia gains independence from France, and as Leisy just pointed out, where the utopia often is that decolonization seamlessly leads to freedom and democracy, in reality that's rarely the case. The Tunisian Jewish population found themselves in a very complicated spot in between. They were definitely not part of the colonizers, but they were also not part of the native Muslim population. And in the years following the independence, anti-Semitism rises, and it becomes increasingly unsafe for my family to live there. So what are their options? They consider going to Israel, but you cannot immigrate directly from Israel from an Arab country. The Jewish population of full French colonies, such as Algeria, were eligible to get citizenship, but Tunisia was a protectorate, so that did not apply to my family either. But nevertheless, in 1961, my grandfather buys tickets for the boat for the whole family to emigrate to France in the hope to apply for residence upon arrival. So this is a picture taken on the day of their departure. My mom is right in the middle. They leave the port of Tunis for Marseille on September 26, 1961, and it is the day of my mother's 11th birthday. And as a birthday gift, she had been given a beaded necklace, And she recalls playing with it and letting it run through her hands as she leans over the railing of the boat until the necklace suddenly breaks and all the beads fall down in the Mediterranean. I could not have imagined a better metaphor for the story of their family. So from this very small countryside village, my mother goes to spending her teens in Paris in the 60s, witnessing the uprising of '68 on the streets. In the meantime, my family is spread around. It lasts a long time before they find an apartment that even half of them can live in. But everyone is wanting to find new roots, and they go in full assimilation mode. There's an unquestioned reverence for French authors and painters, and slowly but surely, Christmas celebration starts to overshadow Hanukkah. So this is my grandmother's, this is her French residency permit. This is, for reference, her Tunisian passport. So it's like a residence card. It indicates that she's part of a big family. I don't know why. I think it also doubles, from what I can see, as like a 30% discount on public transportation, which I guess was a perk. So my grandmother lives in France until her death in 2004 and applies for French citizenship multiple times, but for reasons I am not really understanding, it is always rejected. My mother also never gains French citizenship. When she turns 18, she is on very bad terms with her parents. The rupture caused by the migration has led to many unresolvable tensions in the family, and one night she flees home secretly in the middle of the night. She desperately wants to leave Paris. Going back to Tunisia is not an option, and she does not have money. However, because she's Jewish, she can study for free in Israel if she takes on Israeli citizenship, which is what she does. Because of this, she loses her Tunisian citizenship because Israel does not allow for dual citizenship with an Arab country. So she goes to study French literature in Tel Aviv and works night shift in a big club cleaning glassware. And she does not like being there. She's feeling miserable, and she often refers to this time as feeling homesick, although I am not sure what home she is referring to at this point. Moreover, she is about to be called for mandatory service, which is a responsibility that comes with Israeli citizenship. So once again, she flees. Recent Israeli citizens were asked to pay a deposit when leaving the country to ensure their return. So my mother pays the deposit and doesn't come back until 8 years later when she's pregnant with me, because she's thinking, if I'm pregnant, they will not ask me to serve in the military. After Israel, she briefly goes back to France, and eventually she meets my father, who was a navigator on container ships and from the Netherlands, which leads her to move to Rotterdam. And her marriage to my father grants her Dutch citizenship. This is the moment that she wants to give up her Israeli citizenship, but having deserted, she is scared to go to the embassy, so she puts her passport in an envelope and puts it in the mail and requests, please renounce my Israeli citizenship. This is clearly not the official way to process it, and that notice never went through. And as a result, my brother and I found out 10 years ago that on our Dutch birth certificate, we actually have the Israeli nationality, even if none of us had been there at that moment or ever held an Israeli passport. So, growing up in a very white suburb of Rotterdam, I am extremely confused about who we are. I do not understand the difference between citizenship, inherited colonial culture, spiritual heritage, or the importance all of my family is placing on the food tradition of a country none of us is living on at the moment. As I now understand, food was maybe the most tangible component of our identity that moved with us whatever country we were in. So this confusion leads the six-year-old me exclaim embarrassingly pompous introduction in Dutch like, I speak French and yet I am Jewish. And I was just trying to make sense of it all. And in a way, I am still. We made a trip with my mother to Tunisia in Souk el-Khamis in 2010, and it was just months before the Arab Spring. And I saw how my mother was hoping to find her uncomplicated and idyllic childhood untouched. What we found instead was a town grown out of proportion, unemployment, social tensions, and barely any trace of former Jewish life. In my mother, I saw a woman looking for ghosts, looking for people who would faintly recognize the name of my grandfather, and I had to talk her out of buying the literal ruin that was the house that she was born in, which is more or less this moment. So this trip was the moment that the notion of having a homeland, a place of origin, moved from being something physical, a tangible point of return, to something that now only existed in our memory. Or, as my cousin will say it, Tunisia was never the place where we came from. It was a country that temporarily hosted us. Maybe they hosted us for 500 years, but it was temporary. An image comes to mind by Albert Memmi, the Jewish Tunisian writer who wrote some seminal books on decolonization, and he describes the fate of the Jewish Tunisian as little beetles who one moment are walking on ground that they think is solid, and the next moment they are turned on their back, rootless, and their legs are floundering in the air, and there's still a little bit of soil on their feet. So why am I telling you all this? In an ideal world, citizenship can be seen as a lofty ideal that involves active participation in democracy and casting votes and being recognized as a citizen and carrying shared responsibility for a country. But in real life, the question of citizenship is more messy and muddy and often has another side to it. Which papers do you have, and are they the right ones? To critically look at citizenship, you not have to look at it as, you not just have to look at its affirmative center, but you have to go to the margins. What is required to get it? Who is being denied citizenship, and who doesn't have it? In the case of my family, citizenship is something arbitrary and something they did not always have control over. And when you are in survival mode, as Leisy also pointed out, it's hard to enact the rights and responsibilities that come with citizenship. And that is a fact that is true for an increasingly growing percentage of the world population. As a theater artist, I am deeply influenced by this notion of unstable identity. That same trip to Tunisia was the moment that I started to realize and articulate what the questions are behind my work and what drives the work. Most of my projects take place site-specifically, outside of regular theater venues, because through my family heritage, I am inherently wired to ask questions about our relationship to the spaces that we inhabit and how we inhabit them together. Currently, I'm working on the other side, a work that I'm creating with 4 performers who have been critically impacted by borders in different eras and different times. In different areas and different regions, but together they accumulate to a reflection on how we as humans organize territory and how borders and boundaries affect bodies and cultural memories through generations. So we had a first meeting with a complete team last weekend. It was at my house, and after the meeting we had dinner, and I cooked Tunisian couscous, the festive food that would have been served at special occasions in Souk el-Khamis. So, what is citizenship? I'm not sure. It's a question that I'm trying to work through in my work, but what I do know is that being a citizen and being at home are not necessarily the same thing. Thank you.
So I'm Hiroshi Motomura. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. Thanks to Anne-Marie, Vic, for making this all happened. So I'm reminded actually of something that the writer Anton Chekhov once said, and that is that if you, in the first chapter, you hang a rifle on the wall, by the second or third chapter, it absolutely has to go off. And so I feel the same way about guitars. So what I wanted to do, this is a picture of folk singer Woody Guthrie. And I wanted to talk about a song that, in some ways, it may be one of his most famous songs, but I think it says a lot about citizenship. And it's a very complicated song, much more complicated than one would suppose. I'm going to use it to illustrate something. I'm not going to sing the whole song through, but I want to talk about different verses. I want to talk about the song and what I think it really tells us about citizenship. And the point I'm trying to make, and I think this is going to complement very well what Marike and Leisy did, is to suggest that there are many different ways to think about citizenship. Obviously, we've really heard multiple dimensions of what citizenship could mean, and we also think about it as time, the separation between home. But I want to use this to use some work from Woody Guthrie to think about something else about citizenship, and it's really the fundamental irony of citizenship. And that is that, as our UCLA sociology colleague famously wrote about practically a generation ago, citizenship is a way to include people, it's a way to empower people, it's a way to give them voice, and it's a way to give them meaning and membership. But at the same time, at the very same time, it's a way to exclude people. And the great irony of citizenship is it does both of these two things. And in some ways, the task of citizenship, the tough task of citizenship is to do the inclusion without excessively excluding. So obviously, what you're seeing is that I don't normally do this in the law school. This is not classic law school pedagogy, but I figure I'm in this beautiful hall. This is a song that this is Woody Guthrie. He wrote this song in 1940. You may notice that on his guitar he has this little quasi bumper sticker that says "This machine kills fascists." Let me start with the chorus. This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream water. This land was made for you and me. Now, I first heard that song, I think when I was like 7 or 8 years old. I went to an overnight camp that my parents really could barely afford. It just went for a week. At the time, I remember, I actually, in terms of citizenship, I mean, I was actually stateless. I had no citizenship till I was 15, which is a whole other story. But I remember wondering about this song, because I heard this and I thought musically, I really loved this song, and I was wondering, like, is this song about me? Is this my land? I mean, I was an immigrant kid. Parents spoke very imperfect English. I grew up in San Francisco at a time when being an Asian immigrant was actually quite exotic and strange. And I heard this song and I was wondering really what it meant. And I realized I probably felt the exclusionary idea or the impact of this song much more powerfully when I first heard it than I would later come to feel. And I realized that, but that's not the way I think Woody Guthrie intended this song. He wrote this song in 1940. He was living in a hotel in New York City. And he wrote the song, and he wrote it as a reaction against the song that he reputedly absolutely hated, which was God Bless America, which he regarded as uber patriotic, complacent, And he wrote this song, and the chorus, "This land was made for you and me," was originally "God blessed America for me," not "This land was made for you and me." And so, and I sort of, and as maybe as all immigrant families do, and as the country changes, you feel you belong more. And so I was thinking about the song as something I could actually sing. But it's always struck me that there are many people who would equally feel excluded by this song. Native Americans, especially the part of the song that talks about, in some sense, this is kind of a settler colonial song, right? So I was thinking about that. It's always stayed with me. But Woody Guthrie was a fighter for social justice, and I think he was aware of these sorts of things. And one of the interesting stories about this song, the lyrics change over time as folk songs do. But one of the interesting things about this song is that in various early versions of the song, there are 3 verses that are kind of the social justice verses. The verses where he pushed back on this idea that we should take it for granted that citizenship is something that we all have. And he pushed back in different ways. And these are verses that were not often played. In fact, these are verses that Woody didn't actually sing for much of this period because it was during the 1950s, and there was, I think, real concern that he'd be blacklisted. And I think he was also the kind of person that at some level didn't care. But at the same time, I think he was someone who knew what the reactions would be. And I also think that there are various people, record companies and people like that who censored him. So he wrote this verse, which I think can be thought of as a different take on citizenship. And the take on citizenship is to really question citizenship and to really question the very premise of borders on which the first verse, the chorus, seems to be based. As I was walking, I saw a sign there, and on the sign it said, "No trespassing." But on the other side, it didn't say nothing. That side was made for you and me. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the redwood forests to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. So I think about, when I think about that verse, then I think about the chorus quite differently. I really think of this as kind of a song really about why do we have these borders. And so that comes out, but that was a verse he really wasn't singing a lot. In many respects, it was almost a lost verse. So that's one way to think about this song. But there's another verse where he talks about citizenship in a different way, and that is that if you can be inclusive, the inclusive aspect of citizenship, if that overcomes the exclusionary aspect of citizenship, then it means really sharing in a collective wealth or collective prosperity, if there is prosperity, and really taking part and sharing what you have with others. And citizenship in this sense is a sense of collective good. And this is a song, this is another verse that he wrote, often not always sung, kind of forgotten, that really captures this notion of citizenship, and it really affects the way you think about the chorus as well. In the squares of the city, in the shadow of the steeple, by the relief office, I see my people. As they stood there hungry, I stood there asking myself, is this land made for you and me? This land is your land, this land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. So you think about this a little differently now. It's a different way of thinking about citizenship. It's trying not to be exclusionary. Maybe it's accepting the fact that there is a people, that the border means something. But it also means that once you're inside it, the way you can justify that border is to make the world inside a fair place. That was a message that was forgotten in the way the song was recorded, but is very much part of his original message. That sense of citizenship as mobilizing and creating a space for the inclusionary aspects of collective prosperity. There's also a last verse I'm going to sing for you that also makes me think differently about the chorus and thinks differently about the song, and that is that not the idea of being collectively, I mean, is this the way we treat people? Is this the way we treat people who are homeless? Is this the way we treat people who are waiting, as he put it, in the relief office? I mean, he wrote really, I mean, a lot of his formative years were during the Great Depression, and I think that, you know, he traveled to California and rode the rails and really lived his life among people who were really suffering. But he also wrote another verse, which is often, I think now, the last verse of the recovered song. And it's really belonging as empowerment, not as entitlement, but as empowerment. Citizenship, one of the ways that you justify the exclusionary aspect of citizenship is not just to make it inclusionary in a passive sense, but inclusionary in a participatory sense, inclusive in a way that that brings us together in a way that empowers us to work together for a better place. And so this is the last verse I'm going to sing for you. No one living can ever stop me as I go walking down freedom's highway. No one living can ever make me turn back. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the redwood forests to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. So, thank you. So I'm doing this to make a point because, you know, this is one of these things that I don't normally do in a law school classroom. But it's also because I think that, you know, this is a very meaningful song in a lot of ways. I mean, it's really my own journey from being an immigrant who was wondering whether or not this song was made for you and me. And maybe sometimes I still wonder that, being from an immigrant family, but times have changed and maybe I've changed. But I think that it really illustrates not just the many meanings of citizenship. I mean, citizenship is empowerment, citizenship is collectivity. But I also think that those are the exclusionary aspects of citizenship we often talk about, but citizenship is exclusionary as well. And as I often think about borders and I think about citizenship, I think about what might justify citizenship, what might justify borders. And there's only one answer that I can come up with. And it may not be an answer that convinces everyone. Sometimes it doesn't convince me, but I think it's the one worth naming. And that is that, is to understand that citizenship is inherently exclusionary. There are people who are citizens and people who are not. But at the same time, what justifies citizenship, or the promise of justified citizenship, is the promise that within that space you can create a just society. You can create a society, and that's the society I think that Woody Guthrie is talking about in 3 verses, that in some senses were suppressed, in some senses were forgotten, but certainly recovered. And those are the verses that really stand out as the ones that I carry around with me all the time. And in that sense, I think that there's a lot that Woody Guthrie had to say about not just citizenship, but what it means to belong, but also what it means, the risks of excluding people. So I'll just stop right there. Thank you.
I'll bring you back up onto the stage. Thank you, thank you.
Hello.
Yeah, good. All right, we're good.
Sorry about
Well, I didn't want any of those to end. Thank you so much. And I just imagined, like hearing that whole song will be entirely different now that we've listened to those other verses. You've saved that song for me. What I want to do this evening as we join one another on stage is something a little bit different than previous weeks. I'd just like to take a moment and ask each of us to recap what we heard one another say. What sorts of stories were being told. And then we'll take it from there. We'll move on.
So I can start if that's okay. I was really just moved by both of your presentations. Marike, I was left feeling that it's so important to think about not just the ways that the state creates these categories, but also the meaning that we bring in being present and in bringing life to those spaces in ways that can't ever be captured in legal categories. And that matters, right? And that even as your family has had to move to different spaces, the memories and the meaning that you created there is passed on. And and that in that way, citizenship doesn't matter sometimes, that you still can reach back to something that means so much to a family. Hiroshi, there was so much to think about, but the one point that I'll kind of focus in on is this idea that we can justify borders if we can find a way to make things just within the society, and particularly because my work crosses borders and because we know the history of US intervention in lots of parts of the world that then kind of decrease the value, if you want to think of it that way, of citizenship in those other places. It's still really hard for me then, if that was your one kind of point to hold on to for why citizenship might be a good thing and borders might be a good thing, then I'm left thinking, is it then ever? Because I know the consequences of adding value to one citizenship by taking it away from others.
I can go next. Leisy, what I really sense from the examples that you described is sort of the very violent clash where the legal definition of citizenship meets the lived experience, and the fault lines that you described within families, the examples of the kids driving, but also of families separated. And I think that that's where the legal basis or the way that we define citizenship really creates such a stark boundary within families. I think that that's when it is experienced as something violent and traumatic and exclusionary, and it's hard for the legal definition to live in the same place as what it feels like to be in a place. And in a way, they oftentimes it seems incompatible. And I was really interested just in the history of this Woody Guthrie song and the process of the disappearance of these lyrics and how that has happened. It's when did the song take the shape as we know it now, and is it a form of sort of willful forgetting, or like wanting to have that piece signify that, like the work of art that may have been intended in one way, and then history and society takes their course with it, and it generates this whole different meaning, and that to me is a very interesting process to think about.
Yeah, my sense of, I mean, I'm going to say a little bit about collectively what I got out of listening to both of you, and it really does. I was thinking about all the ways that you really complicate the idea of citizenship. But to me, what's interesting about it is you complicate it in multiple dimensions. One way to complicate it is to say citizenship is about certain things. It could be about identity, it could be about political participation, and just a lot of different things like that. It could be about rights, right? But then those things then get further complicated because, as I think you just said, that there's some of those line up with the law, and some of them don't line up with the law. Some are unrecognized by the law. So that's yet another dimension beyond the strands, that there are groups of strands, and some of them match up differently with the law and others. And from both of you, I mean, I in some senses, both of you told stories that could have been told about my family, right? In my own family, a family of my brother and I, and my mother and my father, my father was a U.S. citizen, my mother was a Japanese citizen. My brother was born in the United States and he was a U.S. citizen, but I was born in Japan, came to this country when I was 3, and I fell between the cracks, and I was actually a citizen of no country. And so one thing I got out of those experiences is that thinking about this in traditional terms of the individual doesn't work because of the family. I think that, and that's one. And another dimension, I think it's really worth, I'm putting together what I've learned from both of you, is that much of this is very ephemeral, and the ephemerality has a couple different dimensions in turn. One is sheer passage of time. A passage in time in 500 years can be short or long, and it depends. And what does it depend on? It really depends on exactly what citizenship means. And so in that sense, this all comes kind of full circle. It's the ephemerality and the transitional nature of any status that in some sense reflects back on what it is that you mean by citizenship in the first place. And so as you were both talking, I sort of was drawing this diagram in my head about, mapping everything you're saying, and I realized I needed about 4 dimensions to capture it.
Yeah, I'm struck by the stories that we tell, aside from the legal side of citizenship, the stories that do or don't get told. Like, Marike, you said you'd never told this story before. And what an extraordinary story it is. And I think feeling in both of your presentations the ways in which real people are living through those, because of those legal definitions and restrictions, living such complexities. And I'm also just struck again, like, then what stories do we need to hear more often so that even beyond the photographic image, to grasp the ways in which these have profound consequences for lived experience. And as well, who co-opts the meaning of a song and the ways in which it travels as a story through our lives.
Yeah, it's not just a story, but also the questions that we ask, right? I remember being interviewed once on a 4th of July radio broadcast, and I think I was being asked as someone who's supposed to know something about citizenship law, and the guy that interviewed me is actually Robert Siegel on NPR, and I said, it's great to have you on the phone. I can talk back to you. And he said, without missing a beat, he said, well, you can talk back to me anytime. I just won't hear it. But he said, so why don't people become citizens? And he was asking me kind of legally. And then I said, wait a minute. Let me tell you about my mother. That's the wrong question. The wrong question. It's not like she woke up every morning and said, am I going to become a citizen today? She didn't become a citizen for 30 years after she got a green card and came to this country. For 30 years, she got the kids off to school, went to work, and came home tired. We ate dinner and I don't know, watched TV or something and talked, and she went to bed. Same thing happened, and 30 years went by. It's not like so the question, why don't people become citizens, is a very interesting question because of the position from which it's asked, and so it's not just, it's the stories we tell, certainly, but part of those stories is the questions we ask and the perspectives that we bring to bear on the experience of citizenship, non-citizenship, quasi-citizenship.
Do you think those stories are different now than it were for your mom in those 30 years?
I think it's an interesting dimension of how time, how travel, how the world was, how that affects the way we think about it. Because when my mother came to this country, she was 27 years old, something like that, and you know, we came on a boat. We came steerage on a boat. We came on the SS President Wilson, and I still have a photo of her and me saying goodbye to her parents, and she wouldn't see her parents again for another 11 years. And I think that's the way she thought about these things, and she thought about travel, she thought about distance, she thought about what it meant in a in some sense, pre-globalized world. And it was a long time before we could scrape together the money to take a flight back. And I think that affects things, and I think that today it might be, this was long before, you know, we had satellite TV or anything. In fact, it was before we had color TV. But it was a little bit after we had TV, but not much, you know. I think it does make a difference, and I think it has effect also on the way people think about citizenship, but I don't pretend to think that that's uniform across all people who are travelers.
I think we can also imagine that in different political moments, these questions are asked differently and people live them differently, even as recent as the Obama presidency versus the Trump presidency, what it cost 10 years ago to get citizenship and to become naturalized versus what it costs now. Like, there's all these pragmatic issues to consider as well.
Could you say more about that?
Well, some of it has to do with laws themselves, but some of it has to do with the discourse in which we live, the stories that are highlighted in the media, and the ways that we feel the consequences of immigration enforcement right now versus what was happening 6 years ago. For example, under the Obama administration, we had record numbers of deportations, but the news were not always talking about them in the way that we're hearing the stories now. So the sense of fear, the sense of not wanting to ever be in the public in any way that might put you at risk of being detained, it feels much more concrete right now than it did, you know, even toward the end of the Obama administration.
And that's racialized to a very different degree, right, in different points in history.
And at the same time, I think that the migration flows are increasing so much. I feel that we live in a time where borders are closed, like more people are moving and more borders are closing and being redrawn. And it seems that we also live in a time where the growth of both is exponential, and that the reaction seems to tend to the narrative of closing down instead of opening up, while more and more people have to leave their, I mean, the mouth of the shark because of climate change or civil injustices or war and poverty, and that's only gonna grow. Like, that's not gonna become less.
I'm just curious, you know, we're talking here, the sense in which all three of you have complicated stories of your own relationship to citizenship and movement. How many of you, just by a show of hands, feel like you also have a complicated story of citizenship, movement, migration? Just yeah, that's most of us, most of you. Right. I wonder if, unless you want to follow through, I wonder if let's take a short, you-know-what kind of break. That's the one where you test out your questions or what you're feeling, or the subject that hasn't come up that really needs to come up. We're going to take 2 minutes to talk to one another and see if the words come out in ways that you feel okay about it. And we're going to come back and have a conversation with you all. That's that kind of break we're having. Ready, go. We're back, we're back, we're back. For you all students, I do have a list of your questions. I'm not ignoring them, but I'm thinking maybe you'll want to ask them yourselves tonight. Or you have other questions to ask now that you've heard these 3 extraordinary speakers. But clearly this is a topic that, it's a topic that we all need to address, and also has very deep personal consequences. So I don't think we should shy away from the tough questions we have in our minds. And I think there are mics that are ready to move out into the audience. If you have to look at a mic person, not that you're a mic person, Jackie. A question, and students, please, this is your space, please don't be shy. Go for it. Oh.
Probably better. Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Probably addressed to Hiroshi growing up in San Francisco.
Yeah.
I believe the San Francisco School Board has proposed allowing non-students who have, non-citizens who have students in the school district, allowing them to vote. What does that do to the whole legal, non-legal definition of citizenship?
Well, I'll give you a short answer, and then we could elaborate on this. But non-citizen voting is a really interesting thing, because non-citizen voting, in other words, voting even if you're not a U.S. citizen, that was actually quite commonplace until the 1920s. I think Arkansas was the last state to do away with non-citizen voting in about 1920 something. And so we think today that one of the things that's most important about citizenship is the right to vote. And that's probably true, I mean, as a factual matter right now. But the idea that people should be allowed to participate in decisions that affect them is an idea that's been around for a long time. In some sense, it's an older idea than the idea that, that citizenship is confined to vote. Now, I now realize that I promised you the short answer, but this is complicated because I think a lot of the reasons that non-citizens were thought of as full participants in society, why not let the non-citizen vote? That was also related to the race question too, because it was white immigrants who were much more readily seen as worthy of the vote at that time. And so it was really not necessarily non-citizen voting, it was actually white immigrant citizen-to-be voting. I wrote a book about this actually called Americans in Waiting. But I do think that there's another way to think about this, and that is that we associate things with citizenship, like if you're a citizen, you can vote. It's kind of the idea that once you prove yourself, you get the benefit. There's a different way to think about citizenship that I think actually drove this idea of non-citizen voting, and that is that if we let immigrants participate, they'll buy in. They'll buy in. They'll be more likely to participate. This is the time to really make them part of the society and to allow non-citizens to vote if they participate in the San Francisco Public School District elections. That will incentivize them to become citizens because they will become civically active in spite of their citizenship. So that's a different way to think about that. It's the citizenship as the merit badge approach and the citizenship as a vehicle for bringing people together and participation. That's kind of a deeper answer.
It kind of depends on a positive and hopeful civic atmosphere that says we want citizens, we want participation. I don't think we're there right now.
We're not there, but the United States, I think, has really backed away from the idea that immigrants are Americans in waiting, but I think the United States is still much more sees immigrants as future citizens than people in other countries with laws that are much more restrictive, where you have a much more ethno-nationalist sense of citizenship. And an Austrian friend of mine once told me, well, you could be, this is an Austrian who's a native German speaker, he said, well, you can become a German, but it takes longer than a lifetime. You know, and I think we've moved away from that sort of, but then what Leisy says about the historical period we're in, because I think we're really in a period of retrenchment and in a period where, I mean, right now, the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service has taken nation of immigrants out of its mission statement. That's in just in the last year.
Great. Do you have a mic?
Okay. Hi. My question was, you pointed out that then they would choose to become citizens, but of personal experience and a lot of experiences of my friends who are not US citizens, it's very hard to get even like a work permit here. Anywhere, most other countries you can get a work permit pretty easily. The citizenship might be harder, but like US does not make it easy, so I think I understand the people that shy away from trying to get citizenship, because most likely that they don't get it, or they might be like pushed out of the US. So I think I just wanted to point that out. I don't know if that changes anything.
It's really true in the sense that though in theory, but not necessarily in practice, if you're a permanent resident of the United States, that it's easier to become a citizen than it is to make that transition in a lot of other countries. The real barrier to citizenship in this country is being allowed to come here in the first place in any kind of legal status. I mean, there are many people for whom there's no line to really even stand in, right? I mean, we have a very restrictive immigration system, so you don't get into the group of people who then become eligible. So in that sense, you know, you're absolutely right.
And I think, like, speaking from the Dutch or the European perspective, I think that the threshold to get in is lower. But then what follows, and there's many artists actually who've made performances also about this, is a very long bureaucratic waiting process in which you're waiting for asylum. So it's interesting to think about what the phases are towards citizenship and how it is really organized differently in each country. But yeah, in the Netherlands, sometimes you can be, you know, legally in the Netherlands while waiting for asylum, but that can take up to 14 years. And
While waiting for asylum?
yeah.
Oh.
So you're there, you have sort of a temporary status. Mm-hmm. You're not a citizen, but it's I guess your case is being looked at, but that process can be drawn out over several years. And so basically you are in a country and but your life is on hold. And then in Europe, it's also a lot of countries look at where did a refugee first reach Europe. It's about what land, you know, this is the image of the land comes back. What was the first land that you touched? What was the first country that you gave your fingerprints to? And that is the country that should be responsible for you.
I also just want to step in and make sure people understand, because it's hard to figure this out from just watching media where they talk about it in very black and white terms that you're either undocumented or you're a citizen, but that's not how it works at all. There are lots of in-between kinds of categories that include things like having a work permit through temporary protected status or DACA or something like that, or waiting for an asylum case to go through that also grants you some protection, but not yet legal permanent resident status, which is the green card that a lot of people call it. And then you have to be in that status for most people for about 5 years before you can apply to become a US citizen. So there's a whole lot of gray areas in that spectrum.
And a big barrier, the process itself is a huge barrier. The wait, the complexity, the money that you have to pay for fees.
And when you look at the USCIS website, it's one page with 5 steps. That's the irony of it, because this is something that we looked at in the piece that I'm currently working on. There is one of the performers came here with her family from Iran, and it took them 14 years. And it's literally, when you print it out, it's not even a full page of text, right? So it's interesting, the discrepancy between the legal process and then 14 years of lives on hold, basically.
Somebody has a mic up down here. Yep, here we go. And then up there.
Hi, hey. Perhaps this was already alluded to before, but how would you define the relationship or the association between nationalism and citizenship?
Thank you for that question.
I looked it up, and I'm going to let the lawyer answer this. But I looked it up before I came to this talk.
Oh,
But I don't think I can explain it.
well, I mean, I'll go back to what I was saying earlier about the exclusionary parts of citizenship and the inclusionary parts of citizenship. My first reaction is that one of the things that happens when people use, the insiders use citizenship to exclude, sometimes it reflects a heightened sense of nationalism, an exclusive sense of nationalism. It's not just that we're citizens and you're not, but it's also we're Americans, we're insiders and you're not. And sometimes the nationalism can be weaponized in that kind of way. And I think that's actually my first reaction to your question. But then, my second reaction is that, there have been times when people appealed to some different kind of a sense of national ideals and say, let's stay with the best traditions of the civil rights movement. And that's the kind of nationalism of equality, of justice, I have a dream nationalism. Now, a lot of people don't associate that necessarily with nationalism, especially these days. But that's in some senses the association of nationalism and citizenship also has that kind of double-edged, meaning. And I think that when people use the word nation and citizenship, I'm always listening for exactly how are they using it. I think these days we're seeing it much more used in an exclusionary sort of way. But there have been different times in history. Times in history it says, I can sit where I want on the bus. I'm an American too. And that's an inclusionary sense of nationalism.
I think so often in this country, though, nationalism has also included racism as part of that dynamic. And so it's hard to separate out when it is about excluding people of color and when it's something that is about including everyone. And that's where it's hard for me to see it in a positive light, that there would be pride in upholding a particular racial vision of what this nation represents.
And the race part is very much a tool of the exclusionary part of nationalism. One thing that, it would be its own evening in itself is the racial history of immigration and citizenship. The first naturalization statute in 1790 limited the eligibility to become a U.S. citizen through naturalization to free white persons, very explicitly so. And then to persons of African nativity and descent in 1870. And racial restrictions to becoming a citizen in the formal sense were not eliminated from U.S. law until 1952. So this is, in some sense, I guess it depends on when you were born, but some of us it feels like just yesterday. Well, just speaking for myself.
But I guess I associate. I think as you point out, the weaponization of nationalism. It feels like that's very much where we are now, and that to me, I associate nationalism with borders, like holding down the fort, closing the borders. Would you say that that's true? Maybe not.
For some sector of the population, yeah, that's what, feels like a thriving nation, to know that you can keep out who you want to keep out, and that seems to have some support in contemporary society.
But this is where the mixed family situation becomes very much really complicates this in a way that's, I think, sort of politically and conceptually very valuable, and that is that I think a lot of people who mobilize nationalism or weaponize nationalism in the exclusionary sense, in the sense that reinforces race, I think there's a world in which we imagine that it's very easy to separate those who are on the inside from those who are on the outside. But in fact, that's, as Leisy pointed out in one of her stories, that this is much more complicated than that, and that people who are undocumented, undocumented people have citizen relatives, and so you take something like the travel ban or the Muslim ban, whatever term you want to use. I think it imagines a world in which everyone who's affected is trying to come here from Iran, from Syria, and for other countries, has no U.S. relatives who are directly affected. So that's a very interesting kind of thing, and a very telling one. And there may have been a time when it was easier to draw a line between, I'm not sure it ever was, but there may have been a time, probably in the 1950s or something, when immigration was an all-time low, when it was more possible to say, well, there are people who are in the country and families, whole families with no U.S. connections trying to come in, but I'm not sure there ever existed such a time. And today, when there's so many families with mixed status, when you're saying, you're on the outside, we're not going to recognize you. We're only going to recognize people on the inside. What you're really doing is you're only recognizing some of the people on the inside, those people without people on the outside. And that the reality of fluidity, globalization of marriage and birth that's one of the big areas, I think both of you pointed out, where there's a mismatch between the law and lived reality.
And I can also speak to that a little bit in the performance that I'm currently working on with Borders. On Borders, as a researcher, I traced all of the U.S.-Mexican border. I did a road trip of 2,000 miles and crossed several times, but also was looking for places where the border is porous, which basically is everywhere, right? Even when you draw a line on a paper with your pencil and you zoom in, it's not going to be a straight line. It's going to be grainy. It's not a hard line, and basically all the hard lines that you draw, even our smallest, the smallest elements in our body, quarks, they're constantly moving, they're not fixed. So this idea that you can draw a line and that it is a fixed entity that keeps people in and out is an illusion. Every time you zoom in on something, it has a certain fluidity, it has a certain porosity. The U.S.-Mexican border is fluid and porous culturally, economically. I was also interested in basically every time you cross the border to Mexico, the first building on your right is a dentist. And we allow, it's like we use the border to exclude people, but then cross the border to then open our mouths and then have people look at our teeth. So there is so much more of a circulation going on in that era that is actually really culturally rich, because it works as a magnet, and so the illusion that a border really divides a space is a myth.
I'd like to add on to that and also point out that this idea of movement across borders, we can think of from a wider lens with the Salvadoran population, for example. Today, Washington, D.C., when you look at the immigrant populations there, Salvadorans make up the largest immigrant population. And you can trace back how did Salvadorans get there when LA is the largest in terms of numbers. And we figured out that it was U.S. government representatives who were in El Salvador in the 70s and 80s and then had to leave to avoid the civil war that was being funded by the United States. And they brought their domestic workers with them because they wanted those women who took care of them and their children there to continue to do so in the US. And so Salvadoran migration to Washington, D.C. was based on these domestic workers, these women who were the first in their families to come to the US, and then slowly through immigration policies that allow for family reunification sometimes, in some cases, they brought families, and now that is the largest immigrant population there. And so this kind of movement back and forth, it's not one-sided in any way at all, even though it gets represented that way in popular discourse.
Let's take another question. Short question here, then we'll go down there, and then all the way up to the top if you pass your mic. Oh, and then Lucy, okay. Maybe you have to press the button.
Most of the discussion tonight has revolved around the challenges of pursuing citizenship, or the difficulties of exclusion, or the complexities on the fringe, families on the fringes. I'm curious what you might offer on for people who have been citizens for generations and maybe take it for granted. What might responsibilities of citizenship be?
Great. Silence is good.
I mean, some of this is the sense of the last verse of "This land is your land," and even without attributing to anyone, you know, the politics of any person like Woody Guthrie or anything like that. I mean, I think that it's really one of engagement. That there's some sense of responsibility to participate and to work for the collective good. I mean, it can be done in different ways, right? It can be done in everything from voting to jury service and really just being informed, right? So that's one way of thinking about it. Another dimension of citizenship that I think is very related to the migration part is to be at least understanding, receptive maybe, but understanding that citizenship evolves and the country to which you belong evolves. And I think it's a firm balance. It's a tricky balance here, because, you know, I don't think it necessarily is one that requires sort of a loss of your own sense of identity. But I think it also at the same time requires receptivity to the way the world is changing. So I think those are the kinds of things I associate with citizenship. That said, it also makes me wonder, maybe I'm not even talking and answering, giving my answer about citizenship in a formal sense, but what it means to be a longtime member of society and deal with the changing nature of that society. And it's also not, it's a changing nature of society and the world that's changing as well, right? I mean, one of the issues, one of the larger points is that, you know, we often talk about citizenship as if there were no immigration. We often talk about immigration if there were no globalization. We often talk, you know, it's like the more I study citizenship, the more I realize it's not really what matters. It's all these larger things.
Mm-hmm. Shall we go on to this other question here? Yeah.
Okay. So I'm really interested in the question of citizenship since I was born in a country that doesn't exist anymore. And by the time when I was 15, I was able to have 4 different citizenships, because the country was divided into 5 different countries, and I belong somehow to all of them through my grandparents and parents. And all of this confusion grew into my question that I have for you tonight. So we are starting to think about the country, usually connecting it to a land and people who live in that country, and they are becoming citizens. And then my question is there, what do you think, is there a possibility for alternative countries where we do have country, people, and citizens, but we don't have a land, where the land would be like virtual land or other places? So that's my question.
I don't know how to wrap my head around that.
We're going to take
Well,
just.
I can, but
We're going to venture short responses because it looks like we don't want to run out of time entirely.
Well, I think there are many aspects of history where people have self-identified as a people, and they don't necessarily have a land, but it's also sometimes they have a land, but they have no control over it, right? I mean, in other words, it's been taken from them. So that's true as well, but that's very much underscores the fact that citizenship can be identity without rights and without a sense of place, and yet it can be very real.
I think we're going to right up there. You got one? Okay, good.
Is it on? There we go. So this is for Professor Abrego. So you mentioned that the U.S., when the U.S. intervenes in other countries, it's decreasing the ability of the other countries to provide justice for its people. In international relations, we have kind of an understood concept from what I've been learning that countries try and influence other countries and they try and protect themselves. So what my question is while the US intervention does decrease a country's ability to create its own version of justice for its citizens, isn't that loss of sovereignty just a reflection of that country's inability to properly provide for its people's citizenship and rights?
I would say that, at least in the case of Central America, it's more complicated than that. It serves a geopolitical need for the United States with its fertile lands, with its natural resources. The location itself has allowed the United States to profit greatly from being able to use it for its trade routes and to exploit the labor there in such ways that the United States has for over a century thought of it as its backyard and would not allow, given just the inequalities in terms of being global powers versus not, there just hasn't been the space for those small governments to be able to fight back in any way that was sustainable, because any time that you'd have democratically elected leaders who wanted to conduct agrarian reform, to give lands back to the people who were from there, the United States, based on companies, US-based companies that were there already using up much of that land and having the ear, those owners having the ear of legislators here, there would immediately be a coup of some sort, right? That happened over and over and over in Nicaragua, in Guatemala, in Honduras, in El Salvador. And so there just hasn't been the possibility for this isthmus area to develop in any way that has been separate from the interests of the United States.
We're going to shift over right here.
Yes, I'll dismiss with the
no.
setup of my questions. Am I on now?
Is it on?
It's on, but it's not on. Can you? Oh,
No.
you can. Yeah, I'll dismiss with the setup. So my question is, I was reflecting on the John Lennon song "Imagine," and imagine the world being as one. This idea that Dr. King had about us being caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality tied by a single garment of destiny. When we look at climate change and the emergence of climate refugees, how does that kind of impact the way we consider what citizenship can be? I mean, the numbers may not be as large as the movement that we see from war and things of that nature, but the philosophical underpinnings of why people have to move. This idea that because people do things in the United States or in Europe is impacting Pacific Islanders and what they have to do. How will that impact what citizenship looks like, and who gets to decide what that looks like, and what is bequeathed to those folks who become citizens in this new definition?
I don't know if I can fully answer that question, but I think that it's safe to assume that people who are now not under threat of climate change will be soon. And so that cities that we consider to be big metropolis in the Western world will come under. I mean, Miami is not going to be there. Amsterdam may not be there. So I think that when we think of climate change, it's important to not think of it as something that is happening in parts of the world, but that it is something that's coming to all of us. And I think that then consequentially leads to the question is, so what does that mean for citizenship? Because I think it this sense of othering that is now being applied to that just doesn't hold anymore.
I think the numbers that you're talking about are actually quite high, right? I mean, in other words, that we're talking about a number of people that is really kind of astronomical when you sort of play out the possible scenarios. So I think in that sense you're really posing a really important question, and it reminds me that when migration is perceived to be in a kind of a small scale, well, I mean then people do the small scale thing. They build a wall, and then when it gets a little more migration, then you sort of back that up with some more enforcement apparatus. And then at a certain point when you're dealing with numbers are such that sooner or later people realize it doesn't work to react that way. You've really got to take. So I see climate change as one of those things that is going to make
this
it
land is mine.
Finally, people are going to realize that you got to worry about why people leave. Right? It's
to the New York Island.
And maybe that's the effect of seeing this as not localized. Well, that's only when they have war. That's why it's going to put a lot of us to the. Now, I first heard that song, I think when I was like 7 or 8 years old. I went to an overnight camp that my parents really could barely afford. It just went for a week, at the time, I remember, I actually, in terms of citizenship, I mean, I was actually stateless. I had no citizenship till I was 15, which is a whole other story. But I remember wondering about this song, because I heard this and I thought musically, I really love this song, and I was wondering, is this song about me?
You want to jump in?
Is this my
We're
land?
just about out of time, and so wherever we jump in, we're like
I grew up in San Francisco
up.
at a time when being an Asian immigrant was actually quite
and I'd certainly
exotic.
like to give each of you a moment, very, very short, to have some last words. And there's a part of me that just wants you to ask Leisy your question again. And even if we cannot answer it here tonight in this room, if we could take it with us, if you could frame that up for us so that we can follow through as we leave here and go to the next places, the next borders, etc.
Well, I offered up the idea of settler colonialism as a way to think about why borders exist in the first place. And it kind of ties back up to your question about climate change and the worldviews that are prevalent in the United States that don't allow us to recognize how we really are in it with the rest of the world. We think only of ourselves, right? That's part of the worldview that is set up in the foundations of settler colonialism as it plays out here. And just to recognize that some of the people that are seeking asylum right now and not allowed to cross the border into the US, who have been there for months, are people who are coming here due to climate change. That and mining and all the other extractive activities from foreigners in their countries. And if we are seeing what's happening and not reacting, we have to recognize this is only going to increase in size, and we have to have better responses.
Last word?
I mean, yeah, following up on that, I would say also thinking of the border as a elusive construct really that only exists to the extent that we consider it meaningful. It's not a physical space. It's a rule that as a society we give meaning to, and it extends beyond national borders, right? The border extends into what we see here in LA. So think about how notions of borders and bordering are not exclusively like in the north or the south of the country, but how they really permeate the way that we design a society.
I think this mic doesn't work, so if you wanted to have a last word, Hiroshi, and we'll end right there.
I was thinking about the prompt, really, what is citizenship? And well, in some ways, I think citizenship is just a type of membership. It's a type of belonging, right? It's a word that we use for that. But then what is belonging? You know, and I think a lot of the way I think about belonging is it's an important part of identity. And all those terms, citizenship, belonging, identity, I mean, they really cut both ways. I mean, they can give us our sense of self, and we can use it for good or we can use it for bad. And I think that's the struggle we all have.
Thank you to the three of you for a tremendous evening. Thank you to you all for weathering Tuesday night, 9th week. Have a great week and long weekend.